The ground beneath Stalag Luft III was sandy. Not the firm, compact earth that might have supported a building or anchored a foundation, but loose, granular soil that shifted with every footfall, that dusted the shoulders of German guards on patrol, that worked its way into the seams of wooden barracks and the creases of prisoner uniforms. 60 miles southeast of Berlin, in Lower Silesia, the camp sprawled across cleared Polish forest land, a grid of huts and watchtowers surrounded by double fencing and coils of wire. The Luftwaffe had chosen this location deliberately. Sand made tunneling nearly impossible. Every shovelful collapsed inward. Every vertical shaft required constant shoring. The German commandant, Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindener-Waldau, a career officer who had flown reconnaissance in the First War, believed his camp escape-proof for this reason alone. He told his staff as much during inspections. The prisoners, he assured them, would waste their energy on doomed projects. The sand would defeat them before they crossed 10 meters. The men behind the wire saw things differently. They were Royal Air Force officers, Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders, Poles and Czechs and Norwegians, even a handful of Americans who had flown with the RAF before their own country entered the war. Shot down over occupied Europe, they had been funneled through interrogation centers and transit camps before arriving at Stalag Luft III in the spring of 1942. Most were in their 20s. Many had never finished university. They had trained to fly bombers and fighters, not to dig through German soil in the middle of the night, yet the culture of the camp bent immediately toward escape. It was more than defiance. It was duty. Every officer imprisoned here understood that escape attempts, even failed ones, diverted German resources from the front. Every guard assigned to search a barracks was one fewer soldier in North Africa or on the Eastern Front. Every hour spent repairing a fence or investigating a tunnel was an hour not spent manufacturing munitions or transporting supplies. To remain passive was to accept defeat. To dig was to continue the fight. They organized quickly. Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, a South African-born barrister and Spitfire pilot shot down over Dunkirk, emerged as the driving force. He had been captured in May 1940, escaped twice, been recaptured both times, spent weeks in solitary confinement, and arrived at Stalag Luft III with a reputation for brilliance and stubbornness. His face carried a scar from a skiing accident before the war, a thin white line that pulled at his mouth when he spoke. He spoke often. In the weeks after his arrival, Bushell moved through the camp's north compound with quiet authority, gathering men he knew, men he trusted, men with skills. He needed engineers who understood shoring and ventilation, forgers who could replicate German documents, tailors who could transform blankets into civilian clothing, intelligence officers who could memorize train schedules and border crossings. He needed patience and secrecy, and an absolute willingness to fail. Most of all, he needed diggers. The plan Bushell presented to his inner circle in the early autumn of 1942 was unprecedented in scale. Previous escape attempts at other camps had been small affairs, single tunnels dug by a few men, crude shafts that collapsed or were discovered before completion. Bushell proposed something larger. He proposed 3 tunnels, each begun simultaneously, each extending well beyond the wire, each capable of moving 200 men in a single night. If the Germans discovered one tunnel, the others would continue. If they discovered 2, the third might still succeed. The project would require hundreds of participants, an underground workshop, a system of air pumps and rails, forged papers for every escaper, civilian clothing that could pass inspection, and absolute operational security. It was madness. It was necessary. The men called the tunnels Tom, Dick, and Harry. Tom began beneath the floor of Hut 123 in the northeast corner of the compound. The entrance was concealed under a stove that sat on a concrete base. Workers removed the base, dug down, then replaced it so perfectly that guards walking overhead saw nothing unusual. Dick started in a washroom in Hut 122, hidden beneath a drain sump that required dismantling and reassembling after every shift. Harry opened in Hut 104, under a stove identical to the one in 123. Each tunnel required a vertical shaft approximately 30 feet deep to drop below the range of German microphones planted around the perimeter. The microphones, sensitive enough to detect footsteps on hard ground, were less effective in sand, but the prisoners took no chances. They descended in silence, barefoot, using wooden ladders they had crafted from bed slats. The tunnels themselves were masterworks of improvisation. Each measured roughly 2 feet square, just wide enough for a man to crawl through on his stomach. Wooden boards scavenged from bed frames lined the walls and ceiling in sections called frames, each frame interlocking with the next to prevent collapse. The wood came from bunks throughout the compound. As the tunnels lengthened, prisoners slept on sagging palliasses supported by fewer and fewer slats. Some bunks lost so much wood they became nearly unusable, but no one complained. The frames required over 4,000 individual boards, each cut and shaped by hand using tools stolen from German stores or fashioned from scrap metal. Knives became saws, forks became chisels, tin cans became fasteners. Nothing was wasted. Air posed the greatest technical challenge. A man crawling hundreds of feet underground, beyond the reach of natural ventilation, would suffocate in minutes. The prisoners designed a pumping system from materials they should never have possessed. They constructed bellows from kit bags, hockey sticks, and leather, operated by a man stationed at intervals along the tunnel, pushing and pulling handles that forced air through a pipeline made from powdered milk tins. Each tin carefully opened at both ends, fitted together, and sealed with tar. The pipeline ran the length of each tunnel, terminating at the working face where diggers filled bags with sand. The system was fragile. A single rupture in the pipeline meant evacuation until repairs could be made. Men working at the face sometimes fainted from lack of oxygen. They were dragged back, revived, and replaced by the next shift. Disposing of the sand required equal ingenuity. Tons of pale, fine-grained soil had to be removed without leaving any trace. The Germans knew the color of the surface soil around the camp, a darker, coarser mixture that contrasted sharply with the subsoil. Any pile of light sand would trigger an immediate search. The prisoners became penguins, a code name for men who carried the sand in long sausage-shaped bags concealed beneath their trousers, secured at the waist and controlled by strings running down each leg. During exercise periods or while mingling in the compound, penguins would release the strings and let the sand trickle out slowly, mixing it into the darker surface dirt with their feet or scattering it in garden plots. Each penguin carried only a few pounds per trip. Disposing of a single day's digging required dozens of trips by dozens of men. It was exhausting. It was tedious. It worked. Security demanded layers of deception. Lookouts called stooges positioned themselves throughout the compound, watching the movements of guards, noting patrol patterns, tracking the German officer known as the Ferret, a man named Hermann Glemnitz who made surprise inspections at unpredictable hours. The stooges used a coded warning system. A man scratching his head meant a guard approaching from the east. A man leaning against a particular post meant the Ferret was near Hut 104. The system had to be instantaneous. If a guard entered a hut where tunnel work was underway, workers below had seconds to cease activity, extinguish lamps, and freeze in place. Above ground, other prisoners created distractions, staged arguments, organized impromptu sporting events, anything to draw attention away from the huts. The Germans never suspected the scale of what was happening beneath them. The forgery operation ran parallel to the digging. Flight Lieutenant Tim Whalen, an artist before the war, led a team that produced German identity papers, travel permits, and border crossing stamps with such precision that they could withstand close inspection. The forgers worked with inks made from crushed pills and boot polish, used pens carved from wood and wire, and copied official documents provided by prisoners who had bribed guards or stolen samples during work details. They produced over 400 sets of papers, each customized for a specific escaper's cover story. A man posing as a French laborer received different documents than a man claiming to be a Danish electrician. Every detail mattered. A misplaced stamp or an incorrect signature could mean arrest, interrogation, and execution. Tailoring operations transformed whatever materials could be found into civilian clothing. Blankets became overcoats. Uniforms were dyed and altered to resemble workmen's jackets. Prisoners melted gramophone records and molded them into buttons. They created convincing leather goods from old boots, fashioned briefcases from cardboard, and even produced German uniforms for men who planned to impersonate railway officials. Every garment was tested, examined for flaws, adjusted until it could pass inspection under bright light. The tailors worked through the winter of 1942 and into 1943, sewing by hand in unheated rooms, their fingers stiff with cold. By the spring of 1943, the operation faced its first major setback. German guards discovered Tom, a ferret probing the floor of Hut 123, noticed. The concrete base around the stove sounded hollow. Within hours, guards tore up the flooring and found the shaft. They descended, explored the tunnel, marveled at its length and construction, then dynamited the entire thing. Von Lindener ordered immediate inspections of every hut in the compound. The prisoners endured the searches without breaking. Dick and Harry remained hidden. Bushell made the decision to suspend work on Dick and focus all resources on Harry. The tunnel under Hut 104 became the sole route to freedom. Harry advanced through the summer and autumn of 1943 at a pace that tested everyone involved. Shifts worked in 6-hour blocks, rotating teams of diggers, haulers, and engineers. The tunnel descended to a depth of 30 feet, then ran horizontally beneath the wire, past the watchtowers, toward the tree line beyond the fence. Surveying the route proved difficult. The prisoners used improvised compasses and measured distances by counting the number of wooden trolleys hauled back and forth along the rails they had laid in the tunnel floor. The trolleys, built from wood and scraps of metal, ran on tracks fashioned from bed slats, allowing sandbags to be dragged from the face to the shaft more efficiently than by crawling. A man stationed at each end of the track pulled ropes to move the trolley forward or backward. It was slow work. A good shift might advance the face by 5 feet. A bad shift, hampered by collapses or equipment failure, might advance it by inches. Lighting came from lamps fueled by fat skimmed from kitchen soup, stored in tins, and burned with wicks made from twisted cloth. The flames guttered in the thin air, casting shadows that danced along the wooden walls. Men worked by that flickering light, lying on their stomachs, filling bag after bag with sand, passing them backward down the line. The heat at the face became unbearable in summer, the air thick and stale despite the pumps. In winter, the cold penetrated deep into the earth and men shivered as they worked. Injuries were common. Splinters drove deep into hands and knees, backs seized from hours of crawling. Claustrophobia gripped some men so violently they had to be dragged out, gasping and trembling. Others developed persistent coughs from breathing sand dust. No one quit. By the winter of 1944, Harry had reached a length the prisoners believed sufficient to break surface beyond the wire. They began digging upward, aiming to emerge in the woods past the fence. The timing was critical. The escape had to occur during a new moon, when darkness would conceal movement. The ground had to be firm enough to support the exit shaft without collapsing, but not frozen so hard that breaking through became impossible. Bushell selected the night of March 24, 1944. The date fell on a Friday, the beginning of a weekend when German bureaucracy slowed and forged travel papers might receive less scrutiny. The plan called for 200 men to escape in a single night, dispersing across Europe, some heading for neutral countries, others attempting to reach partisan groups or Allied lines. It was wildly optimistic. It was the only plan they had. The days before the escape were consumed with final preparations. Each man selected to go received his documents, his civilian clothing, his cover story, and his rations. The rations consisted of hoarded Red Cross parcels, chocolate bars, tinned meat, anything that could be carried and consumed without cooking. Maps were distributed, printed on silk or cloth so they could be concealed in clothing. Some men memorized entire railway timetables. Others practiced their cover stories until they could recite them under stress. Bushell moved among them, calm and focused, addressing concerns, making adjustments, projecting confidence even as he understood the odds. He had escaped twice before and been caught twice before. This time would be different. This time the scale would overwhelm the German response. March 24 arrived cold and clear. Snow still covered patches of ground outside the wire. The moon rose late, providing only a few hours of deep darkness. At approximately 9 in the evening, the first man entered the tunnel. He carried a small suitcase, wore a dark overcoat, and moved carefully down the ladder into the shaft. Behind him, others waited in Hut 104, crammed into rooms designed for far fewer men, silent and tense. The tunnel, after months of work, after thousands of hours and uncountable risks, was finally going to serve its purpose. The exit shaft broke through the surface just after 10 o'clock. The man at the face pushed upward through the final layer of earth and snow, emerging into the frigid night air. He crawled out, oriented himself, and discovered a problem. The tunnel had fallen short. Instead of surfacing in the woods, it had broken ground 10 feet from the tree line, still partially visible from the nearest watchtower. The error was small but catastrophic. Every man exiting the tunnel would be exposed during those 10 feet. There was no time to extend the tunnel further. Bushell, informed of the situation, made the decision to proceed. They would use a rope system. A man stationed at the exit would signal when the guard in the tower looked away, and the escaper would run for the trees. The first few men made it through without incident. Then the pace slowed. The tunnel, designed for steady traffic, began to fail under the strain. Boards shifted, sand trickled from the ceiling. One section partially collapsed, requiring repairs that consumed precious minutes. Above ground, men waited in the cold, spaced at intervals, each one watching for the signal to move. The rope jerked. A man ran. The rope went slack. Another man waited. The system worked, but it was agonizingly slow. By midnight, only 30 men had exited. By 2 in the morning, fewer than 60. The night was slipping away. At 4:30 in the morning, a German guard on routine patrol noticed movement near the tree line. He raised his rifle and shouted a challenge. The man at the exit froze. The guard fired a warning shot into the air and ran toward the tunnel entrance, blowing his whistle. Within minutes, floodlights illuminated the compound and alarms sounded throughout the camp. Guards poured into Hut 104, found men still waiting to enter the tunnel, and began hauling them out at gunpoint. In the tunnel itself, men trapped between the entrance and the exit scrambled backward in panic, colliding with each other in the narrow space, crawling frantically toward the shaft. Some made it. Others were dragged out by guards who descended into Harry and pulled them up by their arms and legs. The escape was over. 76 men had made it out. 3 would eventually reach freedom. The rest were recaptured within days, pulled from trains or found hiding in barns or arrested at border crossings. The Gestapo took control of the investigation. Hitler, enraged by the scale of the attempt, ordered all recaptured prisoners shot. Cooler heads in the Wehrmacht argued for adherence to the Geneva Convention, but the Gestapo operated beyond military oversight. In the end, 50 men were executed, shot in small groups or individually, their bodies cremated, their ashes returned to Stalag Luft III in urns. The camp received official notification that the men had been killed while resisting arrest or attempting to escape again. No one believed it. The executed included Roger Bushell, shot near the Czech border, and dozens of others whose only crime had been digging a tunnel beneath a prisoner of war camp. The tunnel itself was destroyed, dynamited like Tom before it, the entrance sealed, the shaft filled with concrete. Von Lindner was dismissed from his post, later court-martialed for negligence. The prisoners who remained at Stalag Luft III endured tightened security and harsher conditions, but the tunnel and the escape were not forgotten. News of the breakout spread through the Allied world despite German attempts at suppression. After the war, investigations confirmed the murders. Some of those responsible were tried and executed. Others disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. The tunnel beneath Stalag Luft III represented more than an escape attempt. It was an assertion of will, a refusal to accept captivity as the end of service. The men who dug through sand and cold and fear did so knowing the odds were against them, knowing they might never reach freedom, knowing the effort itself was the point. Every bag of sand carried from the face was an act of resistance. Every board fitted into the frame was a challenge to the wire and the towers and the guns. The tunnel failed to deliver 200 men to freedom, but it succeeded in something else. It tied down resources. It humiliated the Luftwaffe. It demonstrated that even in the deepest confinement, even surrounded by enemies and barriers, men could still fight. They could still dig. They could still hope. And in the spring of 1944, for the 76 men who crawled through darkness beneath a camp in Lower Silesia and emerged on the other side of the wire, that was enough.